All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get going um, and get this thing running, and people can join as they are able. First of all, welcome to you. Thank you so much for tuning in to the third in a series of webinars that Adirondack Wilderness Advocates is putting on. This is something we intend to continue doing in order to fulfill our mission. Education is terribly important, and conversation and dialogue is too. So my name is Pete Nelson. I'm a co-founder of Adirondack Wilderness Advocates. I also served on the High Peaks Advisory Group that issued its final report earlier this year. And if there's one thing I've learned in that process and in talking about the need for adaptive management in the park, I've learned that people don't know what that necessarily means and that there's plenty of confusion. It's in our interests to understand it better. It's absolutely crucial to the future of the protection of this wonderful preserve. So why not have an acknowledged expert in adaptive management and monitoring help us sort it out? So that's why we have Chad Dawson with us. Before I got to work with Chad, and I've been working with him quite a bit on a number of initiatives lately, I recognize him as a person of integrity and expertise who served with distinction on the APA board. Now that I know him better, I recognize him as a person of integrity and expertise on this stuff. So nothing's changed that way. Chad is a Professor Emeritus at SUNY ESF. He is an acknowledged expert on wilderness management, wrote a definitive text on wilderness management in general, and an expert on the kind of adaptive management that the High Peaks Advisory Group recommended in particular. He is a board member of Adirondack Wild, and he also joined Adirondack Wilderness Advocates as a technical advisor, which allowed us to form an alliance with Adirondack Wild to pursue best practices in adaptive management and monitoring in the park, things that we're very interested in doing. I want to make a quick public shout out to Dave Gibson. He's not on, but I want to thank him publicly for his openness and letting us proceed this way and share this great resource that is Chad. So without further ado, I present to you Chad Dawson.
Good evening. It's great to be here. It's a warm night in central New York, and it's been a very pleasant fall so far. When we think about the outdoors, we always think about what we like to do individually there. But as we become managers and planners, we have to begin to think about what other people are doing there, the impacts everyone has, and think instead of the I, me, mine of the world, it's the we, us community. And that's what planners and managers really have to be about, is looking at the big picture and thinking about all the different interests that are expressed there, the diversity of opportunities that can be provided to people and those who then enjoy them. We all do have impacts. And so we want to have a good experience out there. We want people to have good experience, but we also have to be aware of what is happening to those experiences between individuals, between the individuals, the environment and the individuals. So it all gets fairly complicated. One of the terms that's been bandied about since the 1950s is the term carrying capacity, and it comes mostly from animal grazing rights in the Western United States. How many animals of various types and sizes can you put on every acre or hectare of land for how long during what season? And that becomes its carrying capacity, its ability to carry and sustain whatever sheep, cattle, bison, whatever you're trying to raise. 1960s came along and everybody began to put it into all kinds of recreation planning. It seemed to be the buzzword of the 60s. And no less, it ended up in 1971, 72 in the state land master plan for the Adirondack Park. It's a good concept, easy to talk about, really very difficult to begin to be able to apply it. And in the 50s and 60s, people were trying to create massive computer models before we really had as much computer capacity as we have now, and just know everything about everything and know what affected what and the whole ecosystem and how people interacted with it. By the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, people were beginning to get pretty frustrated with carrying capacity. It was a great idea, but bringing it down to the ground and being able to use it just seemed to be too expensive, too involved. We didn't know the interactions of everything to everything, plants to animals, aquatic to terrestrial ecosystems, impacts of people using all different kinds of things. And crazy research began to be done. You'd hire a bunch of undergraduates at the University of Colorado, you'd take them out to a mountain meadow, and you'd walk down in these test plots, and they'd put different shoes and boots on them, and how long did it take to trample the vegetation, and all these kinds of things. So they want to know everything about everything. What this pair of boots did, what a cow did, what a sheep did, what horseback riding did. And pretty soon people began to realize, wait a minute, this thing isn't going to work. As a complete, we have to know everything approach. So people backed up. By the mid 1970s, early 1980s even, there were a few things that began to evolve. How could we approximate carrying capacity? I'm not going to tell you all the bloody details because there are a lot of them. All the four federal land management agencies, the Park Service, the Forest, BLM, and Fish and Wildlife Service, each did something different, and each had different terminology. Even though since 1964, they each had to manage different aspects of the wilderness preservation system, the federal system. So they each went their separate ways. And for 10, 15 years, they all developed these different things, but they had one thing in common. What they tended to do was say, all right, we have to approximate carrying capacity. Let's figure out what the critical relationships are that cause problems with visitor use in particular. I mean, there are other studies that were going on related to grazing rights and so forth, but let's just talk about people. So as this evolved, the one that most people knew about was called limits of acceptable change. I'm going to call it LAC, limits of acceptable change. The Forest Service used it, and state agencies began to use it. And I began to do workshops for DEC staff, and I taught it in my classes. It's in my textbook. It became the go-to approach. And the idea very simply was, what were you trying to achieve? How far away were you from that? And what did you have to do to get that threshold to be the same as your goal? It seemed like a doable thing. And what it began to usher in was this idea of transparency to the public, to the users, that in fact, here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it. It's methodological, we'll step it all out. And then it also required them to take action, because the idea was you had to measure something, you had to monitor something. How far apart were you from the goal? What would it take to get there? What management actions would you do to bring those two together? And you had to then look at your success. And that was the beginning of adaptive management. Management's working a little bit. What else can we do to augment that management? What do we have to add to our rules or regulations or our management practices or interventions to be able to achieve the goal we want to achieve? And of course, in the Wilderness Act, it's very clear what it is you're trying to do. And you can begin to work towards that. No human habitation, minimal impacts, leaving no trace kinds of philosophies evolved at that time. And it didn't catch on. And people wonder, why not? It seems so simple, because you went in and you looked where you had problems. Let's call it campsites. Campsites were eroding. They were being overused on lakefronts, along certain rivers in the West. And so they began on them. And the idea of the limits of acceptable change is, we know there's going to be some change from normal, but we also know we don't want it to move too far away from that. So how can we keep it close to a natural condition? And what do we have to do to achieve that? And so that's where this idea of transparency came from, because users said, hey, you're restricting this area. Why are you doing that? And then they had to show why it was. They were having impacts. There were problems, particularly any riparian areas, that interface between terrestrial and aquatic systems. Everybody loves to be by water, and almost all campsites were by water. And we began to realize that was a problem. But LAC wasn't working. Why wasn't it working? So I was with a group of people who began to do some research on that. I'm working with a federal system, particularly with the Forest Service and somewhat with the Park Service. And what began to become clear was not all administrators and managers really liked the idea of accountability, because in adaptive management, you have to state where you were going, what it was going to take to get there, and then if you didn't achieve it, what were you going to do about that to actually achieve that? And the idea is that's what we'll call a closed loop system. You knew where you were, you knew where you wanted to go, and you had to track how you were doing in getting there. That's the part the managers didn't like. They were held accountable, and it was clear whether or not it was working. And so people started to talk about LAC, and then they began to grumble, saying, well, that's really good, but it's kind of like carrying capacity. You can't get there. Oh, it's too hard. We don't have enough staff. And eventually, all four federal agencies began to have meetings together saying, why is yours working? Is it working in the Park Service? They had a different system. Is it working in the Forest Service, but not the Bureau of Land Management? And they're the same lands, and why is that? And so for almost 20 years, there were studies done. What can we do? What can we do? And they spent so much time and money at it. There finally was created, only about 15 years ago, it was an interagency committee to begin to look at it and say, look, we have to achieve these high goals for wilderness areas, the naturalness, the low impact, the ability to say whether or not we're achieving our goals is critical to that. So LAC, about that time, so we're about the late 1990s, and New York State DEC has had a requirement of carrying capacity in it unit management plans. Unit management plan, I'll call it UMPs. You probably all are familiar with that acronym. And so they began to write it in there. And as I did workshops with them and did research for them as an academic, and I would get my grad students involved in these projects, and we kept trying to augment the UMPs and the use of LAC. And I did workshops, and we spent a lot of time trying to help it. And eventually, much like the federal system, it was talked about, it was written about, it was in a lot of the UMPs, it sounded good. And that was how DEC said, that's what we're doing. We don't have a lot of staff, we can't do exactly what we want to do for carrying capacity, so this is what we're going to do. Sounded good. Time went by, nothing got done. Why? Same thing as the federal system. Not enough staff, we'll give them that as a reason. But you know what? We've arrived at 50 years in the Adirondack Park. 50 years, more than that in the federal system. Why isn't it working? Why isn't it working? Same reason. Not only not enough staff, not enough willpower, political willpower to allow yourself to be held accountable. So back up 15 years or so. Here the federal agency says, all right, let's start to figure that out. Meanwhile, here in New York, we're still trying to do LAC. Meanwhile, the four federal agencies got together and said, let's come up with a common terminology. Let's come up with a common practice. And then let's make sure that our people in the field know how to do it. We're going to train them up, and we're going to make them do this. So we were at the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, and I was able to be part of that because I had been working on it. And I got to sit with the four federal land managing officers for those four federal agencies that signed an agreement that this is the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. And they signed an agreement that in fact they were going to begin monitoring and beginning to do this. And so it was a huge kickoff for the federal agencies, for all of them to look each other in the eye, sign a piece of paper that said, yes, this is something that's important. So it was very historic. And I said, can we do that in New York? So they worked on a report, and it's referred to as the Interagency Visitor Use Management, IVUM, is the acronym for the three reports they've come out with. So one is just how IVUM works. The second one is how you do monitoring, which was what LAC was more about, was just, is there a change? Is it positive? What else do we do in management? The third report was carrying capacity, and that was after we've done adaptive management, we've done monitoring for a period of time, can we then begin to say what the carrying capacity is based on a few critical factors? And can we then monitor that and meet our obligation as federal agencies? And of course, we can do that in the state, meet our obligation for carrying capacity. They began to do it. It's now in practice in all the 4 federal agencies. And I'm just going to refer to it now as VUM because we're going to use it in New York State. We're trying to use it in New York State. So then I began to do some workshops on this. I tried to write about it for New York State in addition to doing it at the federal level. And I still found a lot of resistance to it. And it comes back to this idea of a closed loop, that you have to say, where are you going, what you're doing to get there, what's your approach to getting that done. And if it doesn't meet the goal, what are you going to do second, third, fourth, fifth time as you begin to ramp up your interventions or your management activities? So again, let's just use trails or campsites as an example. So if you have campsites that are too large an area, and you can go out and measure this, it's very simple to do, make a map of it. How big is this site? Does it have a lot of satellite sites that aren't supposed to be there? Is this supposed to be just, as the state land master plan would say, for a specific number of people, whether it's along one of the waterways, so maybe you'll have up to 15 people on a waterway, or certainly less on interior areas for backpacking and so forth. And this is very complicated because UMPs aren't all in agreement in terms of the number of people allowed in a designated campsite. Whatever that number is, and whatever the expected limited impact that activity should have there, how well is it doing? Is it needing to be closed? Is it needing to be rehabilitated? Are the satellite sites needing to be closed and rehabilitated as well? Or does having satellite sites suggest to us that we don't have enough campsites in the area, or people don't know where they are? They can't find them, there's not enough signage, there's no maps. There's a lot of things you can do as you start thinking about why there is a problem in an area. It's not just stop people, it's what can we do to help, excuse me, help people have the experience that we want them to have in that area. Well, VUM started to be done in the high peaks, and there are a number of DEC managers who are trying to apply LAC, they're trying to apply VUM, they've been trained in it, and they're not getting a lot of support from administration for this. Recently, they've committed to doing it. This last summer, they committed to doing it, and we hope to see some results in that. But partly it's because the High Peaks Advisory Group, HPAG, which Pete was part of, emphasized it so strongly. Okay, now I'm going to dive back and pick up another thread of this whole conversation. There was this thing called Wildlands Monitoring that the APA and the DEC said they were going to do. This is before they admitted that it was part of VUM. They didn't want to say VUM. They certainly didn't want to say IVUM. They didn't want to talk about the federal system. And so a few people in the Adirondack Park Agency, I was on the board at the time, I worked with the staff, I worked with the DEC staff, and we began to look at something that DEC might implement that wasn't the full VUM, and it was called Wildlands Monitoring. And the idea of it was to take the monitoring component of VUM and embed it into the UMP process. And it was only going to be done related to problem areas. It wasn't going to be all the goals we might have for an area. It was going to be campsites. It was going to be fire pits. It was going to be trail areas, activities that are pretty obvious, because DEC did not want to commit to a full-fledged VUM process. Now, I'm going to put aside, some of you are going to have questions. Can the VUM and the UMP process exist together? And the answer very simply is yes. It's a problem more of terminology than absolutely anything else. But I'm going to come to that question later. So we have this thing called Wildlands Monitoring. And why was it? It was because DEC was nervous about trying to embrace the whole VUM process at once. I'll give them a little bit of that. They are understaffed. They do have a lot of areas. Not all the unit management plans, UMPs, have ever been done for all the areas that there are in the park. Most of them haven't been revised in a timely way. And that's another whole story. The UMP process, we can spend hours talking about. It's archaic. There are much better ways of doing it much more efficiently. And they don't all need to be done individually. But again, that's another whole evening conversation. So here comes wildland monitoring, and DEC and APA at an APA meeting agree publicly they're going to do it. They're going to have it rolled out in a year. That's over 3 years ago now. They've recently committed to doing more VUM. They like the concept of adaptive management, but the problem with their interpretation of adaptive management, it's kind of like what they've been doing all along. They've been doing an open management system, meaning that we'll look at the situation and through professional experience, through anecdotes, through casual observations, nothing really that we would call monitoring. We're going to decide what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. And we're going to write UMPs, which is kind of a wish list. We'll do some of them and we won't do others. And we'll do the ones we want to do because we have staff, or the staff like the idea of doing it or whatever. That's an open system. I'm on 2 digressions now. So we're looking at this thing called Wildlands Monitoring. It's a piece of VUM. It's very specific geographically to a particular problem in a particular place. Whereas VUM is much more broadly applied. The spatial scale of it can be as large as you want it to be or as small as you want it to be. DEC wanted to just deal with very specific problems, waterfront campsites on a particular pond that were being overused. What should we do? Sometimes their interpretation of adaptive management is, we'll do whatever we can at the time. That's not what adaptive management means in the IVUM system. What adaptive management means is every time we don't get to our goal, we will look at what we're doing for management and we'll adapt it so we get towards the goal. It doesn't mean we'll do whatever is convenient. It doesn't mean we'll do whatever the hell we want whenever we get damn good and ready to do it. It means you're going to keep moving towards a goal. So I think the HPAG report scared the commissioner. He's not come out and endorsed it. Certainly the staff are very enthusiastic about it. They've been trained in it. They've gone to workshops. They want to employ it because they want to know how they're doing in the field. Administration, not so much. So remember I said there was a whole nother story over here. Why hasn't the legal system been invoked in some of this? Why has 50 years gone by and no one has taken them to court for never applying carrying capacity? LAC or VUM? Why is there no recreational carrying capacity of water bodies? Again, that's another whole study over there. That's been required for 50 years. Why hasn't that been done? What happens in the courts is that they get what's called agency discretion. Court says we're going to give them a lot of leeway. And if they say it's not feasible to do carrying capacity, and you can find studies that say that, and that's legitimate. But now we know there are ways of approximating carrying capacity. That was LAC and lots of other federal agency programs, and now VUM. Why can't they be forced to use it? Because the courts say agency discretion. We give them a lot of leeway in terms of what they do in their job and applying their job. And if a person can't point to something and say, this is what they said they do, they didn't do it, and they don't have a good reason for it, then what is that? It's called nonfeasance legally. If they don't do it well, that's malfeasance. And those things are all actionable in court. So now, why are they afraid of closed loop management systems like VUM? Because there is transparency, because there is accountability. And yes, it could be used in a court. If they do it well and something goes wrong, their adaptive management isn't getting there, that's agency discretion. They get to keep trying to move that needle till they get to whatever their goal is. Only designated campsite use, no enlargement of the area, no satellite sites, whatever it is that's their goal for that particular area. As long as they're working towards it through adaptive management, the court will allow that. But the other thing is, if you don't have any accountability, the courts go, well, they must have a good reason. So this is one of the fears of administrations, both at the federal level, at the state level, is they're afraid of accountability. And so what it takes is groups like this organization, Adirondack Wild, the council, all of the organizations to keep pushing their feet to the fire and say, this is what it is. For advisory groups like the High Peaks Advisory Group to keep saying, this is important. This is how we're going to know how well we're doing it. And it's through that public pressure, through that tendency to move people forward through conversation, like we're having, through education, which the field staff really are quite able to do, whether it's the APA staff or the DEC staff. They're all quite well trained and could go out and do this fairly directly. They need the gear to do it, which is fairly minimal. Measurement devices, handheld computers in the field, that type of thing. They need to have a written protocol, which the APA was working with the DEC to do with the Wildlands Monitoring, so they have a good start on it. There are plenty of people like Pete and Craig and myself and Dave Gibson and lots of other people in the Adirondacks who are willing to go out in the field and say, look, this is how this works. Let's get going. We're volunteers. Show us how to do it. We'll help you do it. That's the kind of pressure that's going to move this forward. It's been a long, long uphill battle. We finally have the right conversations going on, and we've got to bring it to fruition. We realized that my life was an educator, researcher, and an author. I left that to a certain degree to get into advocacy because I could see I could educate people. I could do the research on it. I could travel the world as I did with World Wilderness organizations, going to World Wilderness Congresses. I have better success at applying what I wrote outside the United States and within certain federal agencies than I do in my own backyard. That's the way it is, but I'm not content to let it just be that. I'd like to see organizations continue to move forward and to educate themselves about what this is. So now I'm going to do a little quick mini lecture on VUM. Why is VUM like UMP? Why do I say that there's a strong similarity there? They both start at the same place. What are your goals? What are your policies? The State Land Master Plan, the Wilderness Act, they're fairly direct. They can't tell you exactly what needs to be done, but they have a pretty good outline of what needs to be done. And there's been 50, 60 years in the federal system of working on this, even more in certain areas that predate the 1964 Wilderness Act. And so there's a lot of experience, a lot of trained people out there. What is the different between VUM and the UMPs is this idea of monitoring. Within each policy, there's certain different decisions that an agency or department can make. This wilderness area is not going to be like every other wilderness area. It's got to meet certain minimum criteria, but some of them are going to have horseback riding in them. Some of them are going to have shelters along a main trail, long distance trail route. Some of them are going to be more oriented towards water-based recreation. And so that changes a little bit how you go about the management of the area and how you take the overall policy and adapt it to that particular unit. VUM, UMP do the same thing. Then what happens after that? Well, once you decide what it is, these are called your desired conditions. Your desired conditions, we're going to have muscle-powered watercraft that will move from these entrance points to these campsites and these trailheads and these portages and moving through a system we create. Okay, so you talk about what it is, how many people you want to minimize the impacts, where they'll stay, how they'll travel, what kinds of equipment they can use, etc. Once you do that, what the UMP does is it just asks the question, is this going to be within the carrying capacity? And it has no mechanism to do that. The inventors of it, remember when in the 1960s, this was passed in 71, 72. So they thought that someday there was going to be some way to go about this. Well, there is. But it's not specifically written into the State Land Master Plan. And that's why Wildlands Monitoring was meant to augment that process. Okay. Meanwhile, the VUM says, now that you know what those conditions are that you want, what are going to be your goals exactly in numbers? What kinds of impediments do you want to add into this to limit the number of people? Do you want to move back the parking area? How are you going to manage it if you get too many people there? You're going to create a permit system. You have to think that through in advance. And that's the VUM system. They're saying, let's think this through before we start it. Let's not just build it. And when people get there and there start to be issues, which inevitably there are if an area has too much use, then start thinking then. VUM says, no, you have to think about that first. And then you think about what is it you're going to measure, what are you going to monitor? You're going to look at the width of trails, you're going to look at the size of campsites, you're going to look at the impact on vegetation, how many people are out cutting trees that shouldn't be cut, the dead and down materials, all you're supposed to use for campfires, but people are cutting trees, or they're scavenging wood for a large area, they're cutting down dead trees that aren't down trees, that kind of thing. So you begin to think through what could go wrong and what you're going to do about it, and then how you're going to measure to see if things are where you want them to be or they're diverging from what you want them to be. And so now you know what you're going to measure, why you're going to measure it, and what you're going to do if you don't meet your goals. And as you have problems and you try different management approaches and you're not, this is where adaptive management comes in. It says, okay, we were going to do three things. We tried all three of them and they haven't got us convergent with our goal. So we're going to add two more that are a little bit more restrictive to the user. We don't like to do that because we'd like to have the users have choice and not feel impeded by too many rules and regs. But in this case, we're going to have to do it. So now we're going to impose a little bit more on their experience to get closer. That's adaptive management. You're always trying to get to the goal and you're always assessing how well you're doing with your management interventions to achieve the goals that you set out to do. Now, if adaptive management doesn't get you there, then you're going to have to go back and review again the whole system that you set in place. Maybe your expectations weren't right. Maybe the way you designed the access to the area wasn't correct. Maybe too many guidebooks are telling everybody they have to see this. Maybe it's really that simple. Now we need maybe a permit system if that many people want to go to this very, very specialized area. Don't want to go there if we don't have to, but it may become the adaptive management technique we've got to do to close the gap between the quality of the natural environment that we said was our goal and the reality of it after users get there. So what happens with the UMP process is technically they're supposed to go back. Remember that so far they say they're going to do a little VUM. They said they were going to do LAC. Most of it never got done. So what they do is they go back in this open management system anecdotally. They look at it and they revise the plan based on the professional manager's experience, their ability to view it, their suggestions to the public. The public gives them some feedback. The agency looks it over to make sure it's compliant with SLMP. and they have another plan and off they go. And again, they'll pick from that what they want to do, what they can afford to do, what they have staff to do. But there's never really a accountability to say, we achieved 50% of the past plan and we're revising this part of it because we didn't achieve what we wanted to do. That's not there. You'll never see a review of a UMP. The VUM process builds that right into it. It not only says that you have to go back periodically and go back to the beginning and see that you're really still trying to manage for your goals and that your monitoring is showing you're getting there. It also says you've got to go back to the public and ask the public what they think about it. And you've got to go through a whole process and revise your whole plan based on what you started out to do, whether or not you achieved it, and the kinds of experiences and impacts that are happening on the ground. So again, the UMP process, very open-ended, no real accountability. There sure is no transparency when you move from one UMP to a revised UMP. Nobody ever questions what it did or what it didn't do, what you tried to do or what you didn't try to do. But the VUM process nails it again and again and again. And it's so transparent that users can go out there and advocacy groups can go out there and look at it, and they can say whether or not they did it. And now that's where the problem comes in for the agencies and administrative agency people in particular, is because this is accountable enough, this is actionable in a court of law. Whereas if you're just relying on agency discretion, you're going to get away with a lot. But under VUM, you can't, because there is an accountability that's so strong, particularly if it's done correctly, that in fact you are locked into doing that. And those are the words that you'll hear a lot of managers preach at. Oh, I don't want to be locked in. As a user, I want them locked in, because those managers change. Different things change, different priorities suddenly appear with different governors and different commissioners and so forth. And the idea is this is a limited resource. We want it locked in. That was the whole point of the Wilderness Act, of the State Land Master Plan, and so forth. And so now my life is advocacy. It's saying, all right, we know how to do it now. Let's get the political willpower to get the job done. And at that, I'm going to leave it open for some questions.
So let me jump in. First of all, thank you, Chad. That laid out the landscape and the issue of accountability really well. Attendees, if you have any questions for Chad, the way that we can do this most efficiently is go ahead and submit them via either the chat feature or the Q&A feature. If you type them in, I'll moderate them and get them to Chad. So we welcome your questions. And thanks again for attending. So don't be shy with the questions. I have one to start things off. Chad, in my conversations, especially in the last few days, actually, with folks, there seems to be a sense that desired conditions are set in stone. That we want to set desired conditions. That's a cornerstone of the whole VOM process. Those we have to understand what they are. We have to set those. We're going to measure against them. So what happens if we don't really understand the desired conditions themselves? An example of that is solitude. If we set solitude as a desired condition, it's not clear what we mean by that, and it's not clear how different people interpret that. So can you comment on how desired conditions themselves fit into this iterative framework where we learn more?
Right. So solitude is a great one because it is very relevant to the individual. I mean, I've been in places on the planet. I was probably the last person there in 20 years. That's great for me. I know that, I can feel that. Is that solitude? Is just not seeing anybody else while you're trout fishing on a brook trout stream, the Adirondacks? You don't see anybody in the 4 hours you're out there? Is that solitude? Again, it's somewhat in the eye of the beholder. So when you talk about desired conditions, you have to think about an area. Let's use the high peaks. You can go into the western high peaks, as I have done, gone bushwhacking. I didn't see anybody for a week. That's solitude. It's in the same unit. So you have to, as a manager, begin to think about the idea of the relativeness of something. Do I want solitude by a mountain pond? That's going to be hard because there's not a lot of them. Do I want solitude by a streamside campsite? Again, if I'm on a place where there's a lot of canoeing, I'm on the Racket River, I'm at a campsite or a lean-to, I'm going to see a lot of people. So it's a relative thing. And so the desired condition, the managers have to help set that idea in this travel corridor along the Racket River. A standard would be, see how this is working? We're taking the idea and we're trying to bring it down to numbers, units, so that we can get accountability. No more than 50 people should pass this particular place on this river in a given day on a weekend in high use season. And then I got a different number for weekdays. I got a different number for off season. And all of those things begin to take into account that there is a relative difference. And you not only know that as a manager, but you can broadcast that to people so the people who don't want to see a lot of other people can go when and where they're likely, we're trying to manage for, likely not to see a high number of people. And that, we call it the recreation opportunity spectrum, so that you know that there are different possibilities in different places at different times. You manage for it. Those are desired conditions. They're not all the same. Not every acre of that High Peaks wilderness is the same. On the other hand, we don't want sacrifice areas in which it's congestion, crowding, etc. And those are the kinds of things we've had to fight back with all the time. So solitude, what is it? It's going to have to be something you bring down to actual numbers and units of time and space, and talk about them. And then adaptive management says, you know, the users weren't very happy about that level of interaction or seeing other people or hearing other people. So therefore, the next iteration of the plan, we're going to take that down, or we're going to allow it to go up, or whatever it is for that particular setting. So it's set in stone for a period of time as a guide, but you eventually can go back to the VUM process as you learn from it, and you can begin to adjust those. That was a long answer to your question, Pete.
No, that's fine. So we have some questions coming in. One question is about successful implementations. So you mentioned pulling inspiration and examples from federal agencies for adaptive management, but have other state agencies outside of New York successfully implemented adaptive management? And if so, what can we learn from them?
So if you've ever been on the Allagash Waterway in Maine, they certainly have gotten involved in it. That's a state federal project together. It's a joint project. And there are parts of it that are just federal, there are parts of it just state, but most of it is a joint project. And you can see that they're working very hard. It became an overused waterway. Once you're on it, it's a little bit difficult to get on and off it. And so you're on it for segments of it. And so they've had to do adaptive management there, and they've had to monitor it. And they've had the University of Maine faculty working on monitoring it, developing systems, evaluating campsites and trails and portage areas and the impacts and so forth. So there's a localized example of it.
Great. Another question came in. This is the $64,000 question for many people. How do we, or can we realistically get the staffing levels we need to actualize this goal? And I'm going to amend that question slightly to also ask, does this kind of approach require an armada of staff?
No, it does not. And what's going on around the world is that, well, actually, think about the Adirondacks momentarily. Water quality issues. Look at the whole issue that's happening now and all the volunteers and people that are working with Paul Smith's looking at aquatic water conditions. And there can be volunteers, there's students, there's faculty, people all feeding into that system. The same thing is being done different places on the planet Once you develop the system, once you train people to do the measurements, you can have people out doing measurements. I've been doing it with graduate students and undergraduate students for decades, training people in the federal system as well as in my classes. If we did a wilderness class, you had to go on a field trip, at least a 3-day field trip. There was no way you were going to take the class as just a lecture. You had to be part of it and go out in the field and see actually what's going on. And people train relatively quickly. There's not a problem in doing that kind of thing. So does it need an armada? No, it doesn't need a flotilla either. What we really need is the willpower of the agencies to create these protocols, to train up some of their people who can be trained the trainers. I mean, there's models for doing this that exist in all types of things. Meteorology people have all kinds of trained people who do meteorology reports. People that do bird sightings and insect sightings and whatever. It can be done. You have to have the political willpower to do it. We do need more staff. We do need a few things out there, but we've let this system kind of bounce along without really pressurizing it from the outside, saying, okay, look, we know what you need to be doing. Please start doing it. And we're here to help you do it. We're not just going to try and advocate for it. We want you to use us to help you get this work done that benefits all of us. Citizen scientists is one phrase that's sometimes used.
Great. Okay, another question. In recent years, DEC has been relying on UMP amendments to get one-off projects approved. Instead of taking a fresh look at an entire wilderness or wild forest in a revised UMP, the amendment addresses a single trail or a single lean-to or what have you. While technically permitted, this has always struck me as a sneaky way to get around LAC, VUM, carrying capacity, et cetera. Was there ever any attempt by the APA, in your experience, to push back on this tendency and request a full UMP revision?
Yes. And I often was the lone vote to say, don't do it. And the rest of the board would vote for it. And the arguments in favor of it is, oh, we don't have enough staff. Oh, we can't really get it done. And partly is because the UMP process is broken and they do need to revise it, but everybody's terrified of changing the state land master plan to make it more specific, like monitoring, for example. If you're going to do carrying capacity as a requirement, then you have to monitor. And what are you doing for monitoring? Show us what you're doing, and what are you going to do with that information related to reaching your goals and so on. In other words, begin to push them towards more of a VUM process. I don't know. I'd love to see it. I would argue that the agency, the APA, is not fully doing its job and pushing back on DEC. Remember, that's why it was created. It was created to be a check and balance, to look at the policy and planning with the managers. And my feeling is DEC generally gets its way. The agency is an executive agency. It is appointed by the governor and the Senate. But what I always argue is, I recall when I gave my oath of office, it wasn't to the governor. My oath of office as a board member on the agency was to the state of New York and the people of New York. And that's what we have to keep reminding the agency about. They've been leaderless for 2 years now. This is all intertwined. There are things that are broken here that need to be pushed on. We've got a new governor who wants transparency. Let's get it.
Great. We have a comment that came in. Let me read through this. So planning is not a DEC strong suit historically. UMPs in some cases are decades old. Change and new ideas come hard for DEC. Staffing is an issue. Less rangers by 50% from the 1980s. They're in charge of too much. This commenter notes Whitney Park being for sale and the owner refusing to sell to the state because of accountability and no responsibility for land and water. Really no statewide document about handicapped sites or trails. This person worked for DEC. The DEC and the APA are broken. Do you agree?
I agree wholeheartedly. What are we going to do about it? Let's do something about it. Let's be constructive. I couldn't agree more with that commentary. I think it's spot on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that speaks for many people. Okay. We are coming up toward 8 o'clock. I'm going to make a last call here for comments. If anyone has a comment to type in, we can take one more for Chad. So we'll wait a bit. In the meantime, Chad, thank you very much for your time in doing this. And I'm sure appreciate the comments and the attendance and listening to these really good ideas. The more that together we can promote the ideas of adaptive management and urge by example and by advocacy, urge the state to move on that, the better. The park needs it. It needs a world-class management system.
Agreed.
Yep. Okay, seeing no other comments come in, I am going to go ahead and close this. Well, yeah, how to get change in my lifetime? That comment just came in. That's a tough question.
At 73, I ask that question all the time. I've been at this for many decades, and my thought is that if we never let up, if we're constructive, if we're, I don't want to say too polite, but relatively polite, be professional about it, I think our persistence is going to wear them down, because I know the staff in both the agency and the APA want to do this. They're trained to do it. They think along those lines, and they just need enough of a break and support from the agency's administration and from the DEC's administration to proceed on this. The public knows it, the users know it, the environmental groups know it, but we can never give it up. We have to keep pushing forward. I believe there will be change in our lifetime, and I'm hoping this governor is one who at least begins to bring some of it about.
Well, that's a fine note to end this on. Once again, thank you, Chad. And I think all of us will continue to push for this and more. I think we're shoulder to shoulder with Chad in knowing that those kinds of pushes can make a difference. So thank you once again. I wish you all a beautiful, beautiful night.
I'm just going to say one thing before everybody goes. We did record this, and I'll be posting it on our social media site. So if you want to go back and refresh your memory about anything, just check back in a couple of days or so.
Great.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.